Hello, I'm Dr. Roby, and I'm happy to be here today in support of a former patient of mine, Dimitri Fisher. Dimitri was born with a congenital diaphragmatic hernia, and what that means is he had a hole in his diaphragm, and in his case, it was a very large hole. And through that hole, the intestine from inside his belly went up into his chest and pushed against his developing lung. That resulted in his lungs being too small and incapable of supporting life once he was born. His initial operation, of course, was to put him on the ECMO cardiopulmonary bypass machine. It requires an incision on the right side of the neck, exposure of major blood vessels there, the carotid artery and the jugular vein, and placing these very large catheters into those blood vessels down into his heart. When you're on this machine, your blood has to be anticoagulated, has to lose its ability to clot. Otherwise, it would clot off this bypass machine. The diaphragm is a muscle that separates your belly or your abdomen from your chest. But in his case, most of his diaphragm was missing. I created a new diaphragm for him out of Gore-Tex and then had to sew it inside his abdomen, 360 degrees, to create a diaphragm. This was done, of course, under the duress of not only him being very small and fragile, but we also did it while he was on the ECMO bypass machine, and therefore while he was anticoagulated. So after surgery, he did well for a couple of days. Then that bleeding, which we were all worried might happen, began to happen. And because of that bleeding, he required several operations to get the bleeding under control. After about 24 hours, bleeding would begin again because he was unable to make clot. Finally, the decision needed to be made to take him off ECMO in order to get the bleeding under control.
So Dimitri is born in September 1st, 2016. And the Bahamas, we had a hurricane that had passed over. It was awful. I could remember texting him that morning, and I didn't get a response back from him. I'm like, okay, it's probably on the flight. No worries. Then later on, I'm calling, no answer. I'm texting, no answer. I could remember I was at the Social Security Administration building when a friend of ours had called. I'm trying to find Kev, and I'm like, you and I both, trying to deal with everything that's going on with Dimitri at the hospital, with the other children. I'm just trying my best to stay focused. And I myself called the sheriff. And I said, hey, this is who I am. I entered the country in June. I just had a baby. His family is looking for his father. So am I. There were two officers who came. And one officer went back to the vehicle. And then he came back to me and he asked me if I had a photo. That officer was able to connect with the Bahamian Consulate office. That's how they identified him, because they had a John Doe in the morgue. Dimitri was going through a lot at that point. His one working lung sometimes used to collapse, and at one point he got really bad that they put him in a medically induced coma. They allowed the paralytic medication to wear off, so he would have been able to wake up Christmas Day for me. So 2016, that was my Christmas gift. He was able to wake back up out of the medically induced coma. Yeah. When I entered the country in June of 2016, CBP stamped my passport for 6 months. So I had 6 months to be within the country legally on a B1, B2 visa. When I realized that Dimitri was going to be on a respirator for 8 months to a year, and I'm already halfway through my 6 months, I go into Homeland Security and I explained my situation to them. And they asked for his medical records. The time was approaching. I still didn't hear anything back from Homeland Security, and so wanting to stay in good standing, I left. I left on the day that would have been my last day within the 6 months. I was out of the country maybe 2 or 3 days, and I was back in here January 1st of 2017. At that point, I was given 4 months from January to April. So again, I had already had the paperwork in, and it was just a matter of constantly going back to see if there was any updates. And then finally, when I went back in March, I was able to be presented with a letter and says, okay, here, we're going to give you what is called a deferred action. It does not negate the fact that eventually I will have to leave. With the deferred action being granted in March of 2017 to March of 2019, Dimitri came out of the hospital in December of 2017. I was granted the permission to work. I had to take care of my family. I had to make sure there was a roof over our heads. I had to make sure my boys had food, clothing. I uprooted their life to save Dimitri's life. So I had to provide. I had to make sure that they were taken care of. I was there at Home Goods, and I did that from 5 in the morning to 9 a.m. And then I came home, and there was just a small window of opportunity for me to have some time with Dimitri, because then, of course, at that time, I had to jump back into the shower, get myself ready to go to work at RMH for 11 a.m., and I stayed until 7 p.m. I did that until I was not allowed to work anymore.